The wooden sign above the bakery door creaked in the Idaho wind, its painted letters spelling out Clara's Kitchen in faded blue. Inside, the air hung thick with the scent of butter, cinnamon, and fresh-baked bread, a warmth that seemed to defy the bitter cold of the mountain town beyond. Clara Whitmore stood behind her counter, flour dusting her apron and forearms as she arranged the morning's batch of apple turnovers in neat rows. She had arrived in Timber Ridge 5 years ago with nothing but 2 worn carpet bags, her mother's handwritten recipe book, and a broken heart that she'd learned to keep quiet. The town sat nestled against the Sawtooth Mountains, a collection of rough-hewn buildings that served trappers, miners, and the occasional traveler brave enough to venture this far north. It wasn't Boston, where she'd grown up. It wasn't even the small Nebraska town where her brief, disastrous marriage had crumbled like poorly made pastry. But it was hers. Clara had learned early that her body would be a topic of conversation wherever she went. In Boston, her mother's friends had whispered about baby fat that never left. Her former husband, Thomas, had been more direct. "You're a burden, Clara," he'd said the day he left her for the milliner's daughter. "No man wants to be seen with a woman who can't control herself." She'd believed him for a while, believed it through the tears and the shame and the long journey west, where she'd been turned away from 3 different establishments who said her appearance didn't suit the image they wanted to project. Timber Ridge hadn't cared about her image. They'd cared that her biscuits were light, her pies perfectly crimped, and her prices fair. The bakery had become the heart of the small town, a place where miners spent their first wages after a claim, where mothers brought their children for birthday treats, where old men gathered to complain about the weather over coffee and bear claws. Clara knew her regulars. Mrs. Henderson always bought sourdough on Tuesdays. Young Billy Preston saved his pennies for chocolate cookies. The Callahan brothers split a meat pie every Saturday after their supply runs. And then there was Holt. He'd first appeared on a January morning during her 2nd month in business. Clara remembered because a blizzard had blown through the night before, and she'd thought no one would venture out. But just after dawn, the door had opened, bringing a gust of snow and a man who seemed carved from the mountain itself. Holt stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders that barely fit through the doorframe. His beard was thick and dark, shot through with premature gray, and his eyes, when they briefly met hers, were the color of storm clouds over granite. He wore buckskin and fur, and snow melted from his boots onto her swept floor. "Help you?" Clara had asked, trying not to stare. "Cornbread," he'd said. His voice was rough, like it didn't get much use. "If you have it." She'd wrapped up a piece, still warm, and when she told him the price, he'd paid without haggling. Unusual for Timber Ridge, where everyone tried to negotiate. He'd taken the bread, nodded once, and left. She'd thought that was the end of it. But he came back. Every 2 weeks, like clockwork. Always cornbread. Always the same corner table, the one by the window that looked toward the mountains. He'd sit there for exactly 20 minutes, eating slowly, watching the town move past outside. He never spoke except to order, and after the first year, Clara stopped asking. She'd just see him come in, nod in acknowledgement, and prepare as usual. "Strange one, that Holt," Mrs. Henderson had remarked once. "Lives up in those mountains like some kind of hermit. Only comes down for supplies, and your cornbread, apparently." "He pays his bills," Clara had replied neutrally. "Sure, but have you ever heard him string more than 3 words together? I wonder if he even knows how to talk to a woman properly." Clara had smiled tightly. She wondered that about most men, in truth. Over the years, she'd pieced together scraps of information about her silent customer. He was a trapper, mostly. Beaver and fox, though those were getting scarcer. Sometimes he guided hunting parties. He had a cabin somewhere high up near Redstone Peak. He'd been in the mountains since before Timber Ridge existed as anything more than a trading post. People said he preferred the company of trees to people, that he was simple, maybe touched in the head, that he'd been disappointed in love once and sworn off women entirely. That last part, Clara thought, didn't seem so strange. Hadn't she done the same? What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that Holt noticed everything. He noticed when she burned her hand on the oven and tried to hide it, working through the pain. He noticed when her smile grew strained during the winter months when business slowed. He He noticed when she'd carefully saved the broken pieces of pastries, eating them herself at the end of the day rather than waste them. He noticed the way other people treated her, too. The subtle jabs, the helpful comments about her appearance. Like when Mayor Pritchard's wife had said, loud enough for the whole shop to hear, "Clara, dear, if you sampled less of your own inventory, you might catch yourself a husband. There's that widower up at the mill." Holt had been there that day in his usual corner. His knuckles had gone white around his coffee cup, but he'd said nothing. He never did. Because what could a mountain man say to a woman like Clara? A woman who ran her own business, who smiled at customers with genuine warmth, who hummed while she worked and always remembered what people liked. He was just a rough man who smelled of pine and wood smoke, whose hands were too calloused for gentle things. She wouldn't want him. Why would she? So he'd stayed silent. For 5 years he'd come down from his mountain, bought his cornbread, and watched Clara Whitmore live her life from the safety of his corner table. He'd memorized the way she laughed. A real laugh, not the polite titter women in town affected. He'd noticed she was left-handed and had to work harder to roll dough smoothly. He'd seen her leave food in the alley for the stray dogs, thinking no one was watching. Through casual conversation with other townsfolk, brief exchanges while buying supplies or selling pelts, Holt had learned about Clara's past, about the husband who'd left her, about the rejections at other establishments, about how she'd buried her mother just before coming west, and the bakery was her way of keeping that connection alive. In Holt's mind, he'd built an entire life that would never exist. Clara in his cabin, filling it with the smell of baking bread, mornings where he'd wake to find her already up, kneading dough, evenings where they'd sit by the fire, her reading while he mended traps, content in the silence they both seemed to prefer. But those were the foolish dreams of a man who knew better. Clara deserved someone refined, someone who could give her a house in town, social standing. Not a primitive existence in a one-room cabin where the nearest neighbor was a 4-hour hike away. The 5-year mark came and went. Holt continued his routine. Clara continued hers. The town continued talking. Then Marcus Aldridge arrived. He came in spring, when the mountain passes finally cleared, riding a fine horse and wearing city clothes that looked absurdly pristine against Timber Ridge's muddy streets. He was handsome in the way of catalog illustrations, neat mustache, tailored coat, hair pomaded into submission. He took a room at the boarding house and immediately began asking questions about local businesses. Within a week, he'd visited Clara's bakery 3 times. "Miss Whitmore," he'd said on his 3rd visit, removing his hat with a flourish that seemed practiced, "I represent a consortium of investors interested in expanding quality food establishments throughout the territory. Your bakery has come highly recommended." Clara had been surprised. Recommended? By whom? "Several travelers passing through. They speak very highly of your goods." He'd smiled, showing very white teeth. "I'd like to discuss a business proposal, if you're amenable." They'd met the following afternoon. Aldridge had spread papers across her largest table, talking about market expansion, distribution channels, economies of scale. His proposal was straightforward. He would buy the bakery outright, rebrand it as part of his company, Aldridge and Company Fine Goods, and keep Clara on as head baker. "You'd have financial security," he'd explained, his pen tapping against the contract. "No more worrying about rent, about seasonal fluctuations. We'd supply the ingredients in bulk, reducing your costs. You'd simply do what you do best, bake." "And the recipes?" Clara had asked carefully. "My mother's recipes." "Ah," Aldridge had nodded as if he'd been expecting this question. "We'd need to standardize them somewhat, make them reproducible in our other locations, add some more contemporary flavors. Timber Ridge is charming, but city folks expect sophistication." Clara had felt something cold settle in her stomach, but Aldridge had continued before she could respond. "There's one more thing." He'd paused, choosing his words carefully. "The bakery's image is important to the brand. We're selling not just food, but an experience, a lifestyle. Our establishments need to project refinement, success." "I'm not sure I understand," Clara had said, though she was beginning to. Aldridge had gestured vaguely. "Miss Whitmore, you're a talented baker. But in this business, presentation matters, both of the product and the proprietor. We'd need you to modify your appearance. Nothing drastic, you understand. Just become more mindful of portions. Perhaps engage in regular exercise, present a more elegant figure. The words had landed like stones in water, making ripples that spread and spread. Clara had known this would come someday. It always did. The implication that she was fine as long as she stayed hidden in the kitchen, but to truly succeed, to truly be accepted, she'd need to change. Shrink. Become less. "I'll need time to consider," she'd said quietly. Of course. Take a few days, but Miss Whitmore." Aldridge had leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Opportunities like this don't come often, not for women in your situation. You're unmarried, getting older. This would provide stability, a future, perhaps even—" He'd trailed off meaningfully. Clara had shown him out, then closed the bakery early. She'd sat alone in her kitchen, among the flour and rolling pins in her mother's recipe book, and tried not to cry. The news spread through Timber Ridge like fire through dry timber. Everyone had an opinion. "Take the offer," Mrs. Henderson had advised. "A woman your age can't afford to be proud. And if losing a few pounds is all they're asking—" "Could be good for business," the mayor had said. "Put Timber Ridge on the map, having a fancy bakery." "You're lucky anyone wants to invest in you at all," Pritchard's wife had sniffed. "Given your circumstances." Only a few spoke against it. Billy Preston, now 14, had said loyally, "Your cornbread's perfect as is, Miss Clara." But he was a child. What did he know of business? Holt heard the news at the general store, where Mr. Chen was discussing it with a customer. Something in Holt's chest had tightened like a snare around a rabbit's neck. He'd gone to the bakery that afternoon, earlier than his usual schedule, and ordered his cornbread. Clara had looked tired. There were shadows under her eyes, and her smile didn't quite reach its usual brightness. But she'd served him as always, and Holt had retreated to his corner table. He'd sat there for 2 hours instead of his usual 20 minutes, nursing cold coffee, watching Clara move through her space. She'd always been graceful in her kitchen, efficient, competent, at home. Now she seemed smaller somehow, despite her size. Diminished. Holt had left without speaking, his cornbread barely touched. That night, in his cabin, he'd stared at the ceiling and made calculations. 5 years of trapping, 5 years of living simply, selling his pelts, guiding hunters. He'd saved most of it, having little use for money in the mountains. It sat in a leather pouch in a locked box under his floorboards, more money than most people in Timber Ridge saw in a year. He'd been saving for winter supplies, for the day his body grew too old for the mountains, for emergencies. But wasn't this an emergency? The thought of Clara changing herself, hiding herself, pretending to be something smaller to fit into Aldridge's vision, it burned in Holt's gut like bad whiskey. The thought of her mother's recipes being standardized and stripped of their soul. The thought of that slick city man owning something that Clara had built from nothing, from grief and determination and love. Holt had never been good with words, but he'd always been good with action. Aldridge had arranged the final meeting for Saturday evening, when the bakery would be closed. He'd invited several prominent townspeople to witness the signing: the mayor, Mrs. Henderson, the newspaper editor. He wanted it to be an event, a symbol of progress coming to Timber Ridge. Clara had dressed carefully that evening, wearing her best dress, dark blue with modest lace at the collar, the one she'd bought for church services she rarely attended. She'd swept the bakery, arranged chairs, set out coffee and a selection of her goods. Her hands had shaken slightly as she prepared. She still hadn't decided. Part of her whispered that Aldridge was right. This was security, stability, a future she couldn't build alone. Part of her screamed that this was surrender, that she'd be erasing herself piece by piece until nothing of Clara remained, only a baker-shaped hole wearing an apron. The guests had arrived promptly at 7. Aldridge had brought flowers, as if this were a courtship rather than a business transaction. Perhaps to him, it was both. He'd made comments throughout the evening about how they'd make quite the team once things were properly arranged. The contract sat on the table. Aldridge had produced a pen with a gold nib. The townspeople had watched with the intensity of spectators at a prize fight. That's when the door had opened. Holt had never attended a social gathering in Timber Ridge. In 5 years, he'd never been anywhere in town except the bakery, the general store, and the trading post. So when his massive frame filled the doorway, still wearing his fur and buckskin, Snow melting from his shoulders, everyone had turned to stare. He'd looked around the room slowly, his gaze passing over Aldridge, the mayor, the assembled witnesses. Then his eyes had found Clara's. Without a word, he'd walked to the table where the contract lay. From inside his coat he'd pulled a leather pouch, worn soft with age and heavy with coin. He'd set it down next to Aldridge's papers with a solid thunk. "How much does she owe?" Holt had asked. His voice filled the small bakery. Aldridge had blinked. "Excuse me?" "Clara, how much does she owe? Rent, supplies, debts?" "How much?" "I don't see how that's any of your concern," Aldridge had said stiffly. Holt had turned to Clara. "How much?" She'd stood frozen, her mouth slightly open. About $300, maybe $350 with spring supplies coming. But Holt, I don't—" He'd opened the pouch and counted out bills and coins with surprising delicacy for such large hands. 300, 350, 400. He'd pushed the money across the table toward Clara. "This is enough to clear your debts and keep the shop running for a year. You don't need to sell. You don't need to change." His eyes had fixed on Aldridge. "And you don't need him." The room had erupted. Aldridge had stood, his face reddening. "Now see here." "I see fine," Holt had cut him off. "I see a man trying to buy something that isn't for sale, not the bakery, her." "That's absurd," Aldridge had sputtered. "This is a legitimate business offer. That requires she make herself smaller, change who she is, give up her mother's recipes." Holt's voice had remained level, but something dangerous had edged into it. "That's not a business offer, that's theft." Clara had found her voice. "Holt, this is too much. I can't accept this. Why would you even—" He'd turned to her then, and for the first time in 5 years, really looked at her. Not a glance, not a brief moment of eye contact, but a full, steady gaze that seemed to see right through her skin to whatever lay beneath. "Because I've loved you for 5 years, he'd said. The words had dropped into the room like rocks into still water. "Every 2 weeks I come down from the mountain, not for cornbread, for you." Holt's voice had grown rougher, the words clearly costing him. "You never saw me. I'm just the strange man in the corner, but I saw you." He gestured at the assembled townspeople, his expression hard. "I saw you running yourself ragged, baking before dawn, cleaning after dark. I saw you smile at customers even when you were so tired you could barely stand. I saw you save the broken pieces for yourself, because you couldn't bear to waste your mother's work." Clara's hands had gone to her mouth. "I saw them," Holt had continued, pointing at Mrs. Henderson and the others. "Tell you to change, to be less, to make yourself small enough to fit into their ideas of what you should be. And you know what else I saw? I saw you refuse. Every day you refused. You kept baking your mother's recipes. You kept smiling. You kept being exactly who you are." He'd taken a breath, his massive chest rising and falling. "I'm not good with words. I live on a mountain because trees don't expect me to be something I'm not. But Clara, you're the bravest person I've ever known. You came here with nothing and built something beautiful, something that matters to people, even if they're too stupid to appreciate it." Aldridge had tried to interject. "This is highly irregular." "I don't care what you think is regular," Holt had snapped. "I care that you're trying to convince Clara she's not good enough, that she needs to change, to improve, to become some polished version of herself that fits in your fancy stores." He'd turned back to Clara. "You don't. You're already—" He'd struggled for words, his face reddening. "You're already everything. The way you hum when you knead dough, the way you remember everyone's favorites, the way you put extra in the bags when you think no one's watching, the way you talk to Billy Preston like he matters, because to you, everyone matters." Tears had started down Clara's face. "I dreamed," Holt had continued, quieter now, "about coming down from the mountain and sitting at your table, not in the corner, right across from you, having you look at me the way you look at everyone else, like I'm worth knowing. But I never thought I was good enough. I'm just a mountain man who smells like pine tar and can barely string 2 sentences together." He'd gestured at the money. "This doesn't buy you. It's not a trade. It's just, I can't stand here and watch you get backed into a corner. Watch you sell yourself because these people convinced you that's the only choice you have. You have choices, Clara. You always have choices." The bakery had gone completely silent. Even Aldridge seemed at a loss for words. Holt had stepped back. "If you want to sell to him, that's your right. If you never want to see me again, I'll respect that. I'll find somewhere else to buy cornbread. A ghost of a smile, though it won't be as good. He'd headed for the door, then paused. But understand this, you don't need to change. Not for him. Not for them. Not for me. You're already exactly who you should be. Then he'd walked out into the night, leaving behind 5 years of silence, broken in one explosive confession. Clara had stood there, trembling, tears streaming down her face. She'd looked at the money on the table, at the contract, at Aldrich, who now seemed smaller somehow, his polished veneer cracking. "Miss Whitmore," Aldrich had said carefully, "this is clearly an emotional moment. But let's be practical. This man is offering you a loan at best, with no guarantee of repayment. My offer provides structure, security." "Your offer," Clara had interrupted, her voice shaking but firm, "requires me to erase my mother, to change my body, to pretend I'm something I'm not. I'm offering you a future. You're offering me a cage." She'd picked up the contract, and for a moment, everyone had thought she might sign it. Instead, she'd torn it cleanly in half. "This bakery is my home. It was my mother's legacy, and it's mine to keep or lose on my own terms." Aldrich's face had hardened. "You're making a mistake. Without proper backing, you'll fail. And when you do, don't expect another offer like this." "Then I'll fail as myself," Clara had said. "I'd rather fail being Clara Whitmore than succeed being whatever you wanted me to become." "Fine." Aldrich had gathered his papers, his movements sharp with anger. "I'll establish a competing bakery right here in Timber Ridge. We'll see how long you last when people have a real choice." "They've always had a choice," Clara had replied quietly. "Some of them chose to tear me down. Some chose to try to change me. But I choose to stay exactly who I am." Aldrich had stormed out. The townspeople had followed, muttering among themselves, uncomfortable with the confrontation. Mrs. Henderson had paused at the door. "You'll regret this," she'd said, trying for kindness but landing closer to pity. "Maybe," Clara had acknowledged, "but at least it'll be my regret." When the bakery was empty, Clara had looked at the money on the table. $400, more than she'd ever seen in one place. Money that represented 5 years of Holt's life in the mountains, cold winters, dangerous hunts, lonely nights. She'd picked up a single bill, turned it over in her hands. Holt had given her choices, real choices. Not an ultimatum, not a trade, not a cage disguised as opportunity. Just freedom. Clara hadn't slept that night. She'd paced her small room above the bakery, thinking about 5 years of a large man sitting quietly in the corner. She'd always thought of him as just another customer, pleasant enough, undemanding. She'd never looked deeper. But now she remembered things, small things. The way he'd always left exact change, never making her scramble for coins. The time she'd dropped a tray of cornbread, and he'd been up instantly, helping her gather the pieces without comment. How he'd waited out a storm in her bakery once, and when she'd worried aloud about him traveling in the snow, he'd simply said, "I'll wait. Your coffee's good." She remembered his hands, scarred, rough, but careful. The way he held his cornbread like it was precious. The way he'd watch her when he thought she wasn't looking. His expression unreadable, but soft. Different from how others looked at her. He'd loved her for 5 years. 5 years of silent devotion, asking nothing, expecting nothing. While others had told her to change, he'd seen her and decided she was already enough. The next morning, Clara had opened the bakery as usual. But instead of starting her regular baking, she'd pulled out her mother's recipe book and turned to a page she'd always avoided. A honey cake recipe her mother had made for special occasions. It required time, care, expensive ingredients. She'd never made it in Timber Ridge because no one would pay what it was worth. But this wasn't for selling. She'd baked through the morning, pouring everything into this one cake. Her gratitude, her confusion, her dawning realization that maybe, possibly, she'd been just as blind as Holt claimed. While she'd been looking at her customers, cataloging their preferences, being friendly and professional, she'd missed someone actually seeing her. By noon, the cake was done, golden and perfect, smelling of honey and vanilla. Clara had wrapped it carefully, closed the bakery with a hastily written sign, and set out for the mountains. She'd never been to Holt's cabin. No one in town had, really. But she knew the general direction, up past Redstone Peak, toward the high timber. She'd asked at the trading post, and the owner had given her rough directions with a raised eyebrow. The hike was harder than she'd expected. Her body, built for standing and kneading, wasn't accustomed to climbing. She'd had to stop frequently, catching her breath, feeling her thighs burn. More than once she'd thought about turning back. But she kept going. She'd found him 3 hours later near a frozen creek. He was checking trap lines, his movements economical and practiced. He'd frozen when he saw her, the trap in his hands forgotten. Clara. Her name and his voice sounded different than she'd expected, reverent almost. She'd been breathing hard, her face red from exertion and cold. I brought you something. She'd held out the wrapped cake. It's not cornbread. Holt had approached slowly, like she was a deer that might bolt. He'd taken the package, unwrapped it carefully. When he saw what it was, something in his expression had cracked. Your mother's honey cake, he'd said softly. You mentioned it once, 3 years ago, said she made it for people she loved. Clara had stared. You remember that? I remember everything you say. They'd stood there in the snow, the silence between them different now, full instead of empty. 5 years, Clara had finally said. You loved me for 5 years and never said anything. Didn't think you'd want to hear it. Why not? Holt had gestured at himself, the fur, the rough clothes, the mountain backdrop. Look at me, then look at you. Your sunshine and warmth and everything good. He'd trailed off. You're the man who saw me, Clara had finished. Really saw me. Not my body, not my potential, just me. She'd stepped closer. Everyone else in town, they look at me and see a problem to fix. Too fat, too plain, too alone. They offer solutions. Lose weight, find a husband, sell the bakery. Always change, change, change. You're not a problem, Holt had said fiercely. I know that now. Clara had smiled, tears starting again. You gave me back my choices. You didn't tell me what to do or who to be. You just gave me room to breathe. She'd pulled out the honey cake, broke off a piece. 5 years, you ate the same cornbread. Never complained. Never asked for anything different. I thought you were just a creature of habit. I was, Holt had admitted. The habit was you. Clara had held out the piece of cake. Try something new, if you want. He'd taken it, their fingers brushing. The cake was sweet and rich, worth every expensive ingredient. Holt had eaten it slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. If you want, Clara had said, her voice shaking slightly, we could start over, from today. Not 5 years of silence, something new. I don't know what that looks like yet, but, Holt had prompted gently. But I'd like to find out. With you. If you'll still have me. Holt had laughed then, a rusty sound, like a door long unopened. Clara Whitmore, I'd walk down from this mountain every day for the rest of my life just to sit in your bakery and watch you work. Having you? Being with you? That's not a question. That's a dream I never thought I'd get to live. She'd kissed him then, standing in the snow with cake crumbs on their fingers and 5 years of words finally spoken. They'd talked for hours after that, sitting in his cabin by the fire. Clara had told him about Thomas, about Boston, about the shame she'd carried and slowly shed. Holt had told her about choosing the mountains, about learning to be alone, about the day he'd first walked into her bakery and felt warmth for the first time in years. I never knew what to say to you, he'd admitted. Every word felt too small. Like always seemed to work fine, Clara had teased. For cornbread, not for, I love you. Try it now. I love you, Clara. I love how you hum while you work. I love how you remember everyone's orders. I love that you're strong enough to carry sacks of flour and soft enough to save the broken pieces. I love... She'd stopped him with another kiss. I think I'm starting to love you too. Is that too fast? We've known each other 5 years. You've known me. I'm just catching up. They'd agreed she'd come back down before dark, but they'd made plans, real plans. Holt would help repair the bakery's roof before winter. Clara would teach him to read better so he could help with orders. They'd take it slow, learn each other properly, build something real. When Clara had returned to Timber Ridge that evening, the town had been buzzing with news. Aldrich had made good on his threat. He'd rented the old millinery and was hiring workers to convert it into a bakery. He was bringing in bakers from Denver, advertising in newspapers, promising sophistication and elegance Timber Ridge has never seen. Clara had simply smiled and gone back to work. Over the following weeks, a pattern had emerged. Holt would come down from the mountain 3 times a week now, instead of every 2 weeks. He'd arrive early, and Clara would put him to work, fixing shelves, carrying supplies, chopping wood. The townspeople had stared at first, but Holt had ignored them with the ease of someone long accustomed to being talked about. At the end of each workday, they'd sit together at the corner table, not across from each other yet, but side by side, sharing whatever Clara had baked that day. They'd talk about small things, the weather, supply orders, Holt's trapping routes, learning the everyday language of partnership. One evening, about a month after Holt's confession, Clara had found him in the back of the bakery with tools and wood. "What are you doing?" she'd asked. "Building something. Turn around." She'd complied, smiling. She'd heard sawing, hammering, muttered curses. Finally, "All right." Clara had turned to find a new sign, beautifully carved despite Holt's rough hands. It read, "Clara's Kitchen, Home Baked with Love by Clara and Holt." "If you want it," he'd said quickly, "I'll fight. I know it's your place, your mother's legacy." "I don't want to intrude," she'd kissed him quiet. "Hang it up." The sign had gone up the next morning. The town had buzzed with gossip, but something had shifted. Maybe it was seeing Holt's devotion made plain. Maybe it was Clara's refusal to hide or apologize. Maybe it was simply time. Aldridge's fancy bakery had opened with fanfare. It was beautiful. Gleaming counters, imported goods, elegant displays. For 2 weeks, people had flocked there, drawn by novelty and sophisticated packaging. But they'd come back to Clara's. Because Aldridge's bakers, skilled as they were, didn't know that Billy Preston needed extra chocolate in his cookies. They didn't know Mrs. Henderson's sourdough had to be crispy on the outside, soft in the middle. They didn't remember the Callahan brothers' standing order or save the end pieces of pie for old Mr. Chen because those were his favorite. Aldridge's bakery sold food, Clara's sold belonging. 3 months after his grand opening, Aldridge had quietly closed shop and left Timber Ridge. Clara had felt a moment of vindication, then let it go. She had better things to focus on. One spring morning, a year after Holt's confession, Clara had woken to find him already in the kitchen. This wasn't unusual. He'd moved into the room above the bakery during winter, and they'd fallen into comfortable routines. But today he was wearing clean clothes, his beard freshly trimmed, looking nervous. "What's wrong?" Clara had asked. "Nothing's wrong. Something's right." He'd taken her hand. "I built my whole life around being alone. Thought that's what I wanted. Then you showed up and made everything better just by existing." "Holt? Let me finish before I lose my nerve." He'd squeezed her hand. "I don't have a fancy ring. I don't have speeches prepared. But I have a cabin that could use a woman's touch. I have hands that are good for carrying heavy things and chopping wood. I have a heart that's been yours for 6 years now." He'd knelt, somehow making the gesture seem natural despite his size. "Clara Whitmore, will you marry me? Will you let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt you're loved exactly as you are?" She'd pulled him up, or tried to. He was too heavy. He'd stood on his own, grinning. "Yes," Clara had said. "Yes, you ridiculous man, yes." They'd married in a simple ceremony that summer. No fancy dress, no elaborate decorations, just the two of them, a circuit preacher, and a few genuine friends. Billy Preston had been the witness, beaming with pride at being included. The bakery had continued, stronger than before. Clara handled the baking and customer service. Holt managed supplies, repairs, and the heavy lifting. In quiet moments, they'd work side by side, her kneading dough while he carved new shelves, existing in the comfortable silence of people who'd learned they didn't need to fill every moment with words. Sometimes Holt would look up from his work and find Clara watching him. "What?" he'd ask. "Just seeing you," she'd reply. "Took you long enough." "I'm a slow learner, but I'm thorough." Years later, when people asked how they'd gotten together, Holt would always let Clara tell the story. She'd talk about the mountain man who loved her in silence, who gave her freedom when everyone else offered cages, who saw her and decided she was already enough. And every time, without fail, she'd add, "The trick isn't finding someone who loves you. It's finding someone who loves you enough to let you be yourself, even when yourself is difficult, even when yourself doesn't fit what the world expects." Holt would just smile and take her hand, their fingers, his rough, hers soft with flour, fitting together like they'd been carved that way. On quiet evenings, they'd still sit at that corner table, now sitting across from each other, sharing whatever Clara had baked that day. And sometimes, just sometimes, Holt would order something different, but mostly he stuck with the cornbread. "Creature of habit," Clara would tease. "Best habit I ever had," he'd reply. And in a small bakery in Timber Ridge, Idaho, two people who'd been invisible to the world had finally learned to see each other, not despite who they were, but because of it.